Welcome to Humanity in Deep Space, Episode 8, The Economics of Space, with our moderator Chris Kimmel and guest Matthew Weinzierl and Alexander MacDonald. Alexander MacDonald is the chief economist at NASA. He was previously the program executive for the International Space Station National Laboratory, the senior economic advisor in the Office of the Administrator, and was the founding program executive of NASA's Emerging Space Office within the Chief Technologist Office. MacDonald is also the author and editor of a number of NASA reports. His book, The Long Space Age, The Economic Origins of Space Exploration from Colonial America to the Cold War, was published in 2017. Matt Weinzierl is the Joseph and Jacqueline Elbling Professor of Business Administration in the Business, Government, and the International Economy Unit at Harvard Business School, and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Recently, he's launched a set of research projects focused on the commercialization of the space sector and its economic implications, viewable at www.economicsofspace.com. Prior to completing his PhD in economics at Harvard University in 2008, Professor Weinzierl served as the staff economist for macroeconomics on the President's Council of Economic Advisors and worked in the New York office of McKinsey & Company. Humanity in Deep Space is moderated by Chris Kimmel. Chris is the lead at Humanity in Deep Space and the co-founder of Space Tango. Prior to this, he organized and led a variety of entrepreneurial ventures.
Hello, my name is Chris Kimmel with Humanity in Deep Space. I want to welcome all of our global audience today for another one of our webinars. This one is going to, be particularly interesting and timely, called The Economics of Space. Before we get into everything, I'm going to thank again our sponsors, which is always important. They're the ones that make these webinars possible, as well as some of the other activities at Humanity in Deep Space. Our lead, Kentucky Science Technology Corporation, National Stem Cell Foundation, the Solar System Virtual Institute at NASA, the Children's Center, Baird Financials, Space Tango, the START program at the University of Kentucky, Higher Orbits, Media Collaboratory, and 22 Solutions. Again, they are our main sponsors and make all of this possible. We're very happy for their support. I'm going to start by asking our two great panelists today, Alexander MacDonald, Alex, and Matt, to introduce themselves. So let me start with Alex. Just give a little bit of background about yourself.
Well, thanks, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Alex MacDonald. I am the chief economist at NASA. I've been working at NASA in a variety of capacities for over 15 years and have particularly focused on, obviously, our commercial space relationships, our Moon to Mars strategy, and increasingly on some of our climate change-related activities. So good here to have a good conversation with Matt and you.
Thank you. Matt?
Hey everybody, I'm Matt Weinzierl. I am a professor at Harvard Business School and I'm an economist by training. Most of my focus throughout my life has actually been on economic policy and what we're trying to do with it in society. But over the last 8 years or so, I've gotten interested in the space sector, probably like many of you actually, and in particular on the economics and business of space. And so now I teach a course here at the business school on that for our students.
Thank you. Let me just also tell all the audience today, as we get going, feel free to ask questions. I will certainly try to get to as many of those as we can. And that's on the chat capability. So please feel free to do that. Before we get going, I want to say one thing. Talking about the economics and cost, you always get into lots of different issues, some of them very, very hard problems. I want to make clear our intent here is not to be negative. Our intent is not to go, oh, this is just going to be ridiculous. It's going to be too hard, expensive. We're never going to do this. It's some point in time, everything was expensive and we weren't going to do it. That's not the purpose, but the purpose is to kind of get real and really try to understand, particularly from a commercial standpoint, what are we really dealing with? What are some of the costs here? Having been involved in starting a couple of companies, I remember a very wise entrepreneur told me one time, is, the biggest mistake you can make is to underestimate your competitors. And in some ways, your cost as a competitor. So we really just want to dig into this and get a sense of what we're dealing with. What are some of the real issues here? Not to gloss them over, but not to be, overly negative, or not to say, oh, this is, we're never going to do this, but really to frame them up. So having said that, let me jump in. It's interesting that both Alex and Matt have found themselves in the space arena, and at least in this place in their careers, they're finding themselves dealing with the economics of space, which you don't find a whole lot of people necessarily dealing with. So I wanted to ask you guys, how did you get here? I mean, how did you get to this spot with space? Matt?
Okay, I can start us off. Yeah, so first I'll just observe that you're right, Chris, that if you try to list all the people who call themselves space economists, it doesn't take very long to get to the end of the list. So Alex and I we've been in touch ever since I got interested in this, for sure. So I got interested, as I mentioned, my research was on the role of economic policy in society, and still is, but I teach a course here at the business school on the role of economic policy in the economy. And as part of that, I got interested in public-private partnerships. And around the time I got interested in that, SpaceX started landing rockets on barges in the ocean. And I always thought of space as a pure public play. What's going on? And so I started looking into the commercial revolution, of which we're all now so familiar, and just got hooked. Started writing academic articles, trying to bring the tools of an economist to this sector to try to understand what's going on, trying to develop some case studies so I could see what the great thinking was inside these space companies, and then eventually developing a course, because one of the privileges teaching at a business school is that you're creating, or helping to educate anyways, the next generation of corporate leaders. And I want to help educate the next generation of commercial space leaders. So that's how I got interested.
Alex?
Yeah, so for me, it actually started when I was a master's student up at the University of British Columbia. And this was 2004, 2005. And I remember watching the first flights of Spaceship One, which of course was the vehicle that won the X Prize. And it was, what looked to me like a completely new phenomena, where individuals had built a spacecraft in their garage. Of course, it turns out that garage was one of the garages of the most well-known aeronautics, innovators of the time, Burt Rutan, and it was funded by Paul Allen, who was, of course, one of the wealthiest people in the U.S. at the time. But it led me down a path of asking a question as an economic historian, which was my training. How long have we been spending our own money on space exploration? Obviously, NASA's government-funded activities, well known as a kind of institution and economic phenomenon, as the driver of space exploration at the time. But how long had we been spending kind of our own funding as high net wealth individuals, or even as individuals as part of private societies? And it turned out, as I dug into it, that in fact, when you look at the 19th century and early 20th century, the majority of the funding for the space projects of the time, which were astronomical observatories, rocket societies, Robert Goddard's early liquid fuel rocketry experiments, they were actually funded by the private sector. And so that led to a PhD in the economic history of space exploration. And I like to joke that, at least at the time, once you do a PhD in the economic history of space exploration, there's almost nowhere else that can employ you other than NASA. Although today that's not so true, because actually right now we're in such a boom of private investment that actually, as kind of Matt knows as well, there's really actually a growing field of economics research and space exploration. And it's really exciting to see that we're having this kind of blossoming moment for the field.
Right. So I want to break this up a little bit, because there's obviously different aspects of this, and kind of start out with, as Matt has referred to in a couple of his articles, he talks about, space for Earth and space for space. Talk about the space for Earth part of this initially. Obviously we are a spacefaring civilization. I always tell people that, this is not the future. We've had people in space since the 60s, been to Mars, been to the moon, have people living and working in space on station, have robots on Mars, which are simply an extension of us as humans. And a lot of it certainly is exploration, but a lot of it right now, when we talk about space stations, private stationing, and a lot of the work done on ISS is really a kind of a space for Earth application. Where are we, do you think, in that realm? I mean, it's talking about manufacturing, biological, medical, et cetera.
Well, that's interesting, Chris. So I actually thought you were even going to start back one step, which is data.
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah. No, I think you're right. Data is certainly, remote sensing.
Yeah, because I think it's so when I mentioned that I like to sort of bring the economist toolkit to this. And so, of course, the first tool out of your belt is the supply and demand diagram as an economist. And one thing I like to think about is part of the revolution that we're all seeing, and I think that most of our listeners are probably familiar with, is the dramatic decline in costs that we've had over the past decade and a half in launch in particular, but also in microelectronics and satellite construction and all this. And whenever you see that reduction in cost, you're going to move what economists would say is down the demand curve, meaning there's lots more things that are suddenly profitable to do up in space that were never before. And so you see this explosion of Earth observation and satellite internet constellations that I think are all really about very much that space for Earth services. And I think that's really exciting because that's exploding right now.
Yeah, I should have said, you're right. I mean, the remote sensing, satellites, all those kinds of things, data are clearly really the first leg of commercialization. Alex, what's your thoughts on all this?
Well, right. So, we can start off with the usual kind of definitions of the space economy, and there's a few definitions out there. Space Foundation has their metrics for tracking the space economy. The OECD does another set of measurements. I tend to go with the Space Foundation ones just because they're domestic here in the U.S. And their most recent estimate was that the space economy was around $469 billion last year. Mm-hmm. It's important to remember that the vast majority of that, probably around 300 billion of that, is simply communication services. That is satellite TV. It is point-to-point satellite communications for data, and increasingly now it's satellite internet. And in this way, actually, as with everything, the future is different. The future is the same. A lot of the growth that we're seeing, the majority of the growth, is actually simply in the main area of space economic activity, which has been communications and still is communications. Yeah. It is still the main area of investment. And when you hear about $15 billion kind of going into new space ventures, a very large portion of that is into essentially communications plays. And what's different is that in the past, a geosynchronous orbit, which is about 36,000 kilometers away, at an orbit where the satellite rotates essentially at the same rate as a specific spot on the Earth, which allows for your satellite terminal to point up at only one place in the sky, which makes your satellite terminals much cheaper. That has been where all of the communications satellites have really been. But increasingly, as the costs of satellites have gone down, as the cost of launch has gone down, more and more entities are seeing that very large constellations of satellites much closer to Earth, which have less latency in the radio communications, they have the potential to be the new potential baseline for comms and potentially even internet, provided that can outcompete the substitute goods, the fiber and the cell towers. So we're seeing a lot of investment in this really core area of communications, as you both have mentioned. Also, of course, remote sensing satellites for applications that are commercial, such as agriculture, but also, of course, for military intelligence, for climate science. These are another kind of one of the core space for Earth applications that we're seeing.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot, obviously, SpaceX and other companies talking a lot about using space to link up the internet and all sorts of other kinds of applications on Earth. Where do you see, before I go on, where do you see, what are your thoughts on what's the next big thing in that area in your mind, if you can identify it? We're kind of taking a step by step. What do you think the next big breakthrough might be in that area?
I think for me, the implications of multi-thousand satellite constellations. SpaceX has started to reach that number, but there's 3 or 4 other entities that have proposed constellations of that scale. Mm-hmm. And it's quite possible that we will see certainly 1 or 2 or maybe even all of them come to pass as real satellite constellations. If we get to that point, we are going to have a lot more crowded environment in low Earth orbit than we probably would have been expecting to, 5-6 years ago. And that has a lot of implications. It has implications for spectrum allocation. It has implications for space debris mitigation. Just recently, the FCC proposed that, in fact, a deactivated satellite has to deorbit within 5 years. I think currently the regulation is within 25 years. So we're already starting to see a lot more attention on regulatory aspects as well as space debris and then space debris removal and mitigation activities. And I think the combination of these very large satellite constellations, plus figuring out how we're gonna manage that as a planet, because it is not just one nation that's responsible for it. I think that's going to be a big area.
Okay.
And
go ahead.
I'll just jump in because I think it's also good to talk. I think, Chris, you were also maybe asking about like what's the next benefit, right? What's the next upside of all this too? And I think that is really an interesting question, actually. So one, I would say two things on that. One is that when you talk to the data providers, the constellation provider, Earth observation companies, and so on, and this connects maybe to the stations, which we might get to soon as well, they have a real problem with awareness out there in the market, that they feel like they have a great product and that most companies just don't really understand how valuable it might be. Now, that may not be true, right? It may be that they think it's awareness and in fact, everyone is actually aware and they just don't want it. But going one step further from we've created the data to now we can make the data useful to a broad range of industries, I think there's a lot of potential excitement there. And then I would say on the satellite internet, it's hard to know exactly just how much that could transform how we live. And I think I certainly can't predict it. The market is great at coming up with useful ways to take advantage of lower costs. And I would venture to say that given the investments that Alex has talked about as well by some major players, they have ideas about how these are going to pay off, right? Amazon would not be pouring the billions that it is into Kuiper if it didn't see a path for that to really make a difference.
Alex, one quick question, because of the back to the kind of space debris question, which is an interesting issue. Do you see that? I mean, do you see that as a potential commercial market? I know companies that have been working on that. I mean, is that an opening? Is that a pathway, perhaps?
It depends, and it depends on the incentives that are set up by governments in the regulatory space. I mean, if the government is paying to remove space debris, then there will be a business in removing space debris. But the question, as with all of these things, comes down to who is going to pay. And unlike something that is a direct service like communication satellites or even Earth observation data, which have kind of direct end users who derive that value, essentially space debris is a type of externality that imposes very distributed costs on the entire ecosystem, but it isn't necessarily in the interest of any one of those entities to pay to remove it, which is why you tend to have government action in these areas. Right. So it's quite a complex area, and it's made more complex by the fact that space debris, active debris removal technologies are inherently dual-use technologies. And so that adds an additional complexity to this already rather complex space. And so there has been a lot more attention paid to it. But we still have yet to see a single case of an active debris removal activity. Okay.
Chris, can I jump in real quick on that too? Because this is I think a really important topic and probably one that a lot of the viewers are interested in too. And you asked, is there an opportunity there? And I couldn't agree more with Alex. This is a classic tragedy of the commons type problem. And I think what's interesting is that you do see some of the companies trying to find a private foothold, right? So are these constellation providers going to want satellite servicing that the debris removal companies might be somehow good at, right? Removing the dead satellite and putting in a new one, because they know that there's this obstacle that either you need public funding or it's not going to work unless you can find that private foothold. So there is a little opportunity there, maybe a big one.
Yeah. Let me move a little bit ahead on again the space to Earth. There's obviously a lot of activity. Has been particularly over the past decade, of companies. I mean, as you know, I was involved in Space Tango. Space Tango is certainly in this space. Nanoracks, Maiden Space, others. Just in terms of applications, whether it's manufacturing, novel materials, biomedical, that could have applications on Earth, and a lot of excitement. But at the same time, we all know that particularly when you're talking about biomedical, there's a pretty long runway there. What are your senses of I guess how are we right now in terms of the runway for those kinds of things, and are we looking for how are we looking in terms of actual applications coming to market in some of those?
Alex, I think this is your ballpark for sure. You should kick us off.
Well, it's a challenging area, and it's a challenging area for a lot of different reasons. And one of the obvious ones is that the number of platforms that we have to do experimentation on, let's just kind of focus on the microgravity R&D and microgravity production. There's really only one that is regularly available to U.S. researchers, the International Space Station. Of course, China also has its space station, and it's begun to conduct R&D activities there. And Chris, I mean, you're very familiar. This is a very long-lived area of research. And when you go back to the shuttle era, there was a lot of research into different types of what I would call kind of microgravity production applications. And that's the idea that you will use the properties of microgravity, the lack of gravity, the lack of convection, and you will use those to somehow make a product that isn't just kind of a little bit better than something on Earth. In fact, it has to be so much better than something on Earth that it is worth making it in space, which is incredibly complex and costly. And there have been a number of different proposed areas, I should say a number of different proposed applications over the years. Protein crystallization, exotic fiber cables, making organs, conducting research that can lead to drug discovery, these types of things. And in the early 2000s, NASA essentially started to really drastically reduce its support for applications in this area. And about 10 years ago or so, we kind of recognized that this was really a missing area, because there really are fundamental discoveries to be found from an R&D perspective. And NASA at the time, and again, we're talking kind of early 2010s, was really just focused on the science applications. And there are different questions that you ask and different approaches that you take if you're not just interested in science, but you're interested in trying to develop production capabilities. And so we started to reinvest in that. We actually most recently announced that we're putting about a $15 million applications program together called In-Space Production Applications. Perhaps not terribly creative, but INSPA is the short NASA required acronym. And we're starting to invest again in these types of applications. But I tend to still have to say, as bullish as I am on us needing to continue to invest in this area, we are still awaiting a single application that has been so productive that we want to do it again and again and again. The challenge is to transition from R&D to actual production of something. And it doesn't necessarily need to produce something that so valuable it needs to come back to Earth. You can also have a regular knowledge production activity, something that would have been like the protein crystallization ideas, where you're basically sending data back to Earth about different protein crystallization structures. That's possible too, but we're still awaiting a process that has gone into that production phase. But I would argue that when we're looking for these reasons to be funding, taxpayer funding for space stations, it's really important to keep these R&D endeavors at the forefront of our thinking, because the reason that it is valuable for the nation to invest in these things is not to send an individual, high net wealth individual up into space. That is something that is very much their personal business, and there probably is a business in it. In fact, we're seeing that business emerge just like our strategy had been hoping it would. But the reason that the nation invests in this is to advance the frontiers of R&D, to advance science, to develop knowledge capacity within the U.S. And to do that, it's important to really conduct R&D both in science and in these application areas. And so we tend to think that for the next iteration of a space station, we have the ISS till about 2030. but we intend the next space station to be a commercial space station. And there's a lot of really complex economic questions about how that commercial space station is going to sustain itself. I mean, there's a whole hour-long conversation to be had of the various thoughts and observations there. But I would submit that it is going to be important to at least maintain a strong commitment to doing the R&D to get to applications, because even if we're still another 10 years away from those applications, it is that investment that has been spurring a lot of the new small companies that have emerged, Redwire, Space Tango, over the years. And that has been very beneficial to the space ecosystem overall, because it brings new people and new types of money into the equation. Different types of organizations like pharmaceutical companies, materials companies who wouldn't otherwise be interested necessarily in space stations per se, they get knowledge derived even from experiments that don't lead to full production capabilities.
Right. Okay.
Chris, I was going to, Alex, that was really well said. I was just going to add one quick point, because you mentioned at the very top of the webinar that you were often advised, be careful about your competitors. And I think that, especially when we're talking about stations, as Alex alluded to, Earth is your big competitor. I mean, it's really a lot easier to make stuff on Earth. And so I think a lot of the examples that people have been really excited about, that's been part of the problem. So you take Z-band, super fancy fiber. It would be great if we could make it in space, but it's so cheap to make fiber on Earth that it's got to be just incredibly great. And now the one little note of optimism I'll throw into this is that when you talk to the commercial station people and you ask them how they think they're going to surmount this long-standing problem, they say, well, first of all, launch costs keep coming down. So it's going to be cheaper for us to compete with Earth. Plus, we're going to build stations that are custom made to make the manufacture and experimentation cheaper as well. So the whole point is, if we can keep pushing these costs down, then we might be able to compete with the terrestrial competitors a bit better.
I want to ask a question. Somebody asked you, Clinton Kelly, who has collaborated with us in Humanity and Deep Space. Some of you may know Clinton actually was on the last Blue Origin flight. So he's now an astronaut. I was very interested in this whole issue of economics. In fact, he's one of the people who, 8 months ago, talked to me about, hey, we ought to do something about looking at the economics and cost of space. He asked, one of the questions he asked me to make sure that we asked was just kind of building what both of you said. His thoughts is, because we haven't yet found any big application, any killer app yet. Not that we won't, but he wanted to, was curious, would our focus perhaps be better, our attention be better focused, both in terms of cost and work, on simply getting launch costs down? Because his point was, the lower the launch cost, the more people are going to have an opportunity to get in and experiment.
Yeah, I mean, launch cost, and I mean, I guess I would say that in some very important sense, NASA has been playing that role since at least the early 2000s, when you think about the COTS program and all that it helped launch in terms of SpaceX, which we now think of as a commercial provider in many ways, but of course has benefited greatly from NASA's support all along. And if Starship happens, maybe it's another order of magnitude reduction in launch costs, and that's pretty remarkable. I mean, then you're at a level that, whether it ends up being $100 a kilogram or something like that, who knows? They also aren't going to have any competition, so they may not have to charge that little. But I think, to Clinton's question, we're on that path. Yeah.
So it's been very clear that low-cost, reusable access to space has been the goal for, dare I say, close to 100 years, because this was obvious to Robert Goddard too. The question has been, how do you get there? Because there have been different strategies. And I think it's important to remember, what the revolution in COTS was and what was so different about it. Because people have been trying to get to low-cost, reusable access to space before. The space shuttle was an attempt to that. And I would say it made incredibly important contributions to reusability. It was the first reusable spacecraft.
Right.
Turns out there was a lot of costs with that reusability, however, at that time. But then there were additional efforts, things like the Venture Star project. And Venture Star was another attempt at a low-cost reusable project. But those were actions that were essentially being done on the supply side. And, to an economist, one of the real revolutions of the COTS program was it said, well, what if instead of trying to act directly on the supply side, we acted on the demand side?
Yeah. Let me ask you, what's COTS now for those who might not
the Commercial Orbital Transportation System, which was two different funded Space Act agreement awards, roughly on the order of $500 million. But that part was the first kind of stimulus, which was to try to stimulate the supply side. In many ways, the much more important piece that happened simultaneously was the CRS contracts, which was the Commercial Resupply Services contracts. And those were multi-billion-dollar contracts that were essentially there to any companies that were able to resupply the International Space Station with cargo. And one of the parts that I think often gets left out in the stories of how companies like SpaceX got to the level of capability that they're now at is the role of the International Space Station. Because without the International Space Station, without a permanent home for humanity in space, for NASA, for the US government, we would not have had the demand for bulk material delivery that we were then able to use to stimulate innovation within the marketplace. And that was a big shift. And in fact, when you look at the actions that we're taking now in a wide variety of areas, from the commercial lunar payload services contracts, which are essentially science and technology focused robotic delivery services to the lunar surface commercially, all the way to the human landing system, which of course Starship is now part of too. We have started to really use the strategy of both some supply side stimulus, but then a lot of attention on the demand side to spur market innovation.
Yeah.
We're using that in many domains, and I think that's one of the big strategic shifts, I would say, of the last 15 years. Part of the challenge with that, though, is you don't get to decide with that strategy what the costs of things are.
Right.
You actually have to discover that through not even just kind of one procurement, but an iteration of procurements. The question of what the next set of contracts will cost you is dependent on a lot of things, including the market power of various companies.
Right.
So it's not just a matter of technology and focusing on the technology, although that's important too. And we have a whole mission directorate dedicated to that with the Space Technology Mission Director at STMD at NASA. But the use of these demand side tools to spur market development, I think, is a really core component to it.
Okay, I'm going to get to a few of the questions here, but I want to ask before we get to a couple things. One, just to follow up on that, I think one of the things that I've certainly seen start to happen relatively lately is, actually not just space companies, like I mentioned, or TechShot or BioServe or companies like those, Space Pharma, getting into this area, but also actually, material and biomedical companies coming in. I know National Stem Cell Foundation is one, Lambda is another. And there are others that are actually now universities, research centers, hospitals actually getting in on their own, which I think is really happened over the past 8-9 years is a really a good sign.
Yeah, the more, I guess, to the point that we haven't had a killer app, right?
Yeah.
The more people taking shots on goal on commercial stations from places we wouldn't necessarily have thought of before, the better. I mean, yeah.
No, I agree. Somebody asked a question about Earth. You're talking about Earth to space. Wanted to bring up the question in terms of commercial solar power. Again, had a question just about what are your thoughts on that as a possibility, space option application.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say a couple things about it that I think are of interest to me. So one is it's a really big market, right? So, I mean, if you're looking for large addressable markets that might justify huge investments up in space, power is a great target. And so it's natural that this is one that always keeps rising to the surface as something worth the investment, potentially. There are a lot of technical obstacles, but I would say there's a couple of potentially promising signs. So on the one hand, I think it's ESA, maybe Alex, that just announced that it's funding some more research into whether we can make this happen. As technology has gotten better since the last major push, maybe now it's going to be something that we can actually accomplish. So it seems like the public agencies are getting re-engaged. NASA may have a similar project in mind. I'm not entirely sure. And then just from the business school standpoint, we've spoken to a couple of startup/founder folks who are interested in this area specifically. And I think there's definitely some of that venture money and ideas going into this as well, because it is such a juicy target if you could figure out a creative way to make it work.
Yeah, so I tend to put it for the moment into a similar category to one of the other questions I saw in the chat there, which is related to asteroid mining.
Right.
And asteroid mining as a concept first emerges in about the 1870s. So the first stories written, essentially science fiction stories about asteroid mining, occur, in the late 19th century. Space-based solar power stories actually start emerging in the 40s and 50s. Herman Oberth proposes some of these concepts, but of course Jared O'Neill and his space settlement studies, of course, kind of really take that to a new level of social interest. The problem with both of them right now, and it's similar to what we were talking about before in terms of microgravity production, is the substitute good. And the substitute good is simply terrestrial power generation, which for the moment is much, much cheaper. And that is true for deriving resources from other places as well. There have been a number of studies, you can see a number of NASA studies on both of these subjects. The challenge has simply been that they are not within order of magnitude comparability at this time to terrestrial projects for baseline power generation, even for a lot of spot power generation, and for kind of precious metal and rare earth metal access. That does not mean that it is not worth investing in R&D projects related to these things, and that's one of the hard things sometimes I think for folks to really I would say kind of accept, which is that we can see a future where these are part of our human economy and they are a stimulus to us moving out into space. But as I pointed out, the people in the 1870s and the 1940s saw the same future, but they weren't necessarily all that close to it becoming reality.
Right.
And I think that's the nature of working on really long-lived historical economic processes, which is that these things may take a lot longer to really pencil out as true economic opportunities. But in the meantime, that doesn't mean that you don't work on them. That doesn't mean that you don't conduct research, that you don't conduct really significant experiments, that you don't invest in significant technology demonstrations related to them. But I think it's also important to recognize that when you're doing economic analysis and it suggests that there really isn't really necessarily an economic business case, which may be one reason why there aren't significant investments, coming from the private sector to make some of these things happen. It's important to recognize that there's a reason that that's happening.
Yeah, which I think speaks to also, the obviously the critical role, not now, but historically, that the public sector and government has played in these technologies, because you're right. I mean, there's, in some cases, a lot of things that have been developed or happen because someone would imagine the unimaginable. And the private sector, being the private sector, oftentimes is not willing to put those kinds of that's kind of seed capital in there. So I think, even now, I mean, we talk about, SpaceX and Blue Origin and things like that. Well, obviously, yeah, they're private companies, they're commercial, but NASA funds a good deal of their work. And so that's just the way it is.
Yeah, I guess I'll give the listeners who are looking for a note of optimism, I'll throw it in a little bit, which is that I think
you're not supposed to do that, Matt. We're economists. We're the dismal scientists.
The dismal scientists. One thing that I think is a shift that is welcome is that, and I don't think it's a bubble. I think it's a response to SpaceX and other things, is that there is a ton of talent and attention, even from the investor and capitalist class, so to speak, going towards making really big breakthroughs in space. Now, they may not deliver, right? I mean, it's always hard to know, but it used to be that if you wanted to work on these technologies, you were at NASA or a prime contractor, and those were your destinations. And now the flourishing of entrepreneurial ventures in space gives us a new option, I think, for really moving the needle.
Yeah, I'd agree. And in fact, about 10 years ago, when we were in the Emerging Space Office and we put out a report that said we were entering a second space age, there was some raised eyebrows to that. Now it's actually really just fully appreciated that, yeah, this is basically a second space age that we're in, with all of the attendant opportunities that come with that. I mean, there are a lot of people who in very short periods of time have made significant wealth out of space. The old joke used to be that, if you want to become a millionaire in the space industry, start as a billionaire. That is literally not true anymore.
Yeah.
It is inaccurate in a number of ways. And that's a big transformation. And so I agree, Matt. I mean, this is actually a period of a pretty unprecedented opportunity. That does not necessarily mean, however, that we're any closer to asteroid mining.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to not switch gears, but move ahead a little bit on the continuum here and talk a little bit about, still space for Earth, but also space for space. When we talk about cost, there's a lot of things going on. A lot of these commercial, not all, but a lot of these commercial possibilities, applications, people spending money on space stations, Mars, lunar activities involve humans. And I've often suspected, and I don't, my gut has told my intuition that a lot of times I don't think that we really have a handle on building in those costs of really what it's going to take to do these kinds of things using humans. Forget not just radiation exposure, but there's still a big question out as to whether we're even as humans built for space, and particularly deep space. And so, when we talk about these costs, I know I was doing some research recently, and I think they talked about the space station being, something like 366 billion revenue, et cetera. But how do we? What are your senses of when we start talking about humans? That to me adds a whole nother dimension in terms of cost and commercial viability.
For sure. I guess I would just say the question is, are humans made for space? Like, nope, absolutely not. There's no question that it's really dangerous out there. I will say, though, all that said, this is probably an area where there's more daylight between Alex and me than on some of the previous part of this conversation. I'm a bit of a booster for the human side of space, unlike most people in the sector. And for me, we can talk a lot more about it. For me, it's that I think there's it's not only a source of cost, but it's a source of demand. That I think there is a persistent desire among people, not necessarily a large share of people, but at least a non-trivial minority of people to explore. And so there's just a lot more money that can be made if you can get them up there.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's any daylight, Matt. I mean, I agree entirely, and that was very well said. And not only is there a significant source of demand from humans, but actually, in many respects, it is easier to get into unit production for human spacecraft activities than for many robotic space exploration probes, simply because humans need the same things all the time. Whereas robotic spacecraft, as we see with things like James Webb Space Telescope, with Curiosity rovers, they tend to be very different every time because scientists want to use different instruments to ask different questions. Whereas humans have a lot of the same demands, pretty much day in, day out. And so there's actually a lot of potential to get kind of down the learning by doing curve, so to speak, using kind of economic terminology, and to get into higher rates of production, as in fact we have started to see with Dragon, with Falcon. And so I actually think that it's important to kind of just step back and look at what the source of demand for humans really is. And early in the space industry, Arthur C. Clarke, when he was proposing geosynchronous satellites, one of the reasons he proposed geosynchronous satellites was because he thought that they would be a demand source for humans, because you were going to have humans there swapping out the tubes for the radios, because that's what he'd been doing in the Second World War. And he thought, well, maybe that will be how we get out into space. And I think one of the challenges is whenever we derive these types of applications, we tend to, over time, find that many of them, like communication satellites, tend to be outcompeted by robotic activities. But that does not remove the inherent human demand for being out there in the first place. And in fact, I tend to break down the demand for space exploration, which is very different than commercial space activities in general, like ComSats and Earth observation and all these other things that have a utility in different ways. But the demand for space exploration for me breaks down into signaling and then intrinsic motivation. And signaling for nation states is the idea of costly action that credibly transmits information about the nation state. This is what we saw in the first Cold War. One might argue that it's similar to some phenomena that we're seeing today. And that drives a very significant portion of national expenditures in human space flight and human space exploration. But the other driver is the demand by individuals for experiences in the cosmos. And we're now thankfully at the period of time, and we couldn't have said this 5 years ago, where we're starting to see a real significant expansion in that. We're seeing it in suborbital, we're seeing it in orbital capabilities, and in the not too distant future, I think we all here hope that we'll be seeing it on and around the moon as well. And that is a pretty robust source of demand. It seems to be fairly consistent. The question is, what are the scale of it? What are the price points people are willing to pay? And then how does that compare to the nation state expenditures for signaling? And where does that leave various leverage points within the system? But I would agree, Matt, that human space flight is a source of demand. And in fact, we have been using human space flight as a source of demand to spur market innovation now for a good 10 plus years.
Yeah, that's great. Sorry, Chris, is it okay?
No, go ahead.
I have one more thing.
Go ahead.
One thing that I remember stumbling across when I was first learning about the sector, people often look for historical analogs to what's happening in space. And one of the classic ones that everyone thinks of is the extension of the railroad, basically across the United States. And I remember somebody pointing out to me, it might have been NASA historian, Alex, remind me. Roger Lanius,
yeah.
I think it was Roger who pointed out to me, the problem is railroads were connecting two existing cities. So there was a reason to build that railroad. And so part of the reason I think about people in space being potentially useful for driving economies of scale is that if we had some people up there we had to service and who had demands, building that railroad to them is another reason to do it. So.
Yeah, I'll actually, I agree that there's a lot of these uses of the analogies, right? You use the early American colonial example, airmail. There's a lot of these analogies which have value, but they are imperfect because you do not have arable land, you don't have oxygen, you don't have other existing people you can trade with, to our knowledge, within a reasonable number of light years. But I think the interesting thing that, maybe we can put this on the table kind of here on the close, that, the longer I've looked at it, the more I've come around to the idea that in many respects, the economics here are actually downstream of culture. That what drives humans into space in many respects is a desire for a cultural expression of humanity that includes a future that has humans traveling throughout the cosmos. And that is a cultural expression that in many respects is as legitimate as any other cultural expression, as music, as art. And they often will go through a lot of the same kind of hand-wringing, right? Well, what is the purpose of art? Is there a good economic case for these things? But in many respects, if you have a strong culture that believes in expressing itself in that way and spends its resources, which isn't just money, but time, education, in achieving these things, then it happens regardless of what calculations people do to, make one cost-benefit analysis argument or another.
Yeah, I think that's true. In fact, that's one of the interesting things about, I think, what we found with our conversations and other things with humanity in deep space is the human side of this. How do we maintain our humanity, the history of humans, and our need and quest to explore and to discover ourselves in art. And I'm always I'm always impressed by when I come across a lot of astronauts and scientists and others who actually have spent a lot of time writing poetry or other kinds of things to express that. So I think that's true. But I want to ask again, not to be this. I mean, not that we're not going to be able to overcome this, but there's two. When we talk about humans, there's a lot of people use analogies that they talk about history of exploration and the ancient explorers and things like that. Of course, basically two things that have been a part of the billion years of evolution of life on Earth. One is our context within nature. One, we've evolved within nature, and secondly, of course, is everything has evolved in a 1G environment. I'm just it seems to me that those two not that we can't overcome those challenges, but to me those are particularly when we talk about deep space, those are pretty significant. People forget, when you're on space, people say, well, we've had such people on station. People can look out the window on station and see Detroit, and they're getting food every 2 or 3 months, and those kinds of things when we talk about deep space are not going to be feasible, at least in the beginning.
Yeah, no, that's very true, Chris, and I think there's going to be an interesting kind of emergent, human social psychological phenomena from the first true mission out into deep space that I think will have its own analogy to the overview effect, or even the Earthrise, which really came from differences in human perspective. And certainly Chechen Liu has written about this in the 3 Body Problem series of kind of, as of many others, of the human experience of being truly in the void and away from any known human reference points. And since thus far no humans have had that, we don't quite know what that result is going to be. But I think it's going to be a very interesting one because it's going to be different, and it's going to be a more isolating one, I think, than the Earthrise or overview effect. But I think it could still nonetheless be fairly transformative and important for humanity as a whole.
Yeah, I guess this is a great conversation, and I love the economics being downstream from culture point, Alex. I think that was really lovely. I guess one other thing I would just add here is that Chris, you're talking about humans in deep space, which I agree is way off on the horizon. And as long as we're talking way off on the horizon, I think another thing that is potentially inspirational to folks is the chance to try new things, right? So especially as an economist, part of the reason I got interested in this is, the big vision of different space colonies that can try different ways of organizing society. And again, that's way off in the future. But to me, the reason that's nevertheless really useful to think about is that I always tell my students this at the end of our space course, which is that part of the value of thinking so hard about space and some of these far off questions is they help you see Earth differently.
Absolutely.
And I think even the idea of historical analogs, I'm grateful that at least many of the people who think about expanding out into space will often say we have to be sure we don't make the same mistakes or repeat some of the mistakes we made here when we thought about expansion. And so I think that's also a value.
Yeah, no, I agree. I always like to say, the great thing about space is when you try to do things in space, you're forced to innovate. And when you innovate, not only do you innovate for space, but you innovate for potential applications on Earth. We can figure out how to grow strawberries on Mars. We might be able to grow those in the middle of the Sahara Desert, to make an oversimplification. But I agree. I think that's one of the challenges that we face that has a real upside. In the few minutes we've got left, or a couple of things. Well, one thing I want to talk about a little bit more is this is a little bit outside the what we're talking about, but I think it's important, and I think it's a cost, both in terms of money and in terms of politics, et cetera. And that's the whole issue of governance and law. As we, our last webinar, we had one of the people we had on the webinar was Robert Thomas, Admiral Thomas, who was a former Navy tax sub captain. We had actually two other Navy officers, and we were talking about some of the analogs and similarities between what they face, particularly a submarine captain who takes his crew underwater for 3 months and those kinds of things. And I know he did some stuff I think he told me he went for the Joint Chiefs, and we got a little bit into this question, and one of them said, and he said, of course, space is the ultimate high ground. And I think it's something we can't discount in terms of how difficult that's going to be. I know that we've had, I don't know how many countries sign the Artemis Accord, but China and Russia haven't. So how do you see this kind of entering into our conversation about cost and applications and commercial possibilities?
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that while China and Russia haven't signed the Artemis Accords per se, they have signed the Outer Space Treaty.
Yeah.
And that's not something to be discounted, because in fact it's an important reminder that in the 1960s, when the first space stage was in its major period of flowering and acceleration, there was a recognition of the deep geopolitical security and just fundamental human importance of space, and that actually led to a series of treaties, the Outer Space Treaty being the first of them, that established the rules and norms for the peaceful uses of space that we've now actually been benefiting from for the last 50 years, and essentially form the core international governance programming on which the billions of dollars of commercial value that have been derived from space have been based. And I think what the Artemis Accords signal to me is a recognition that as we're entering the second space age, there is a need to re-engage in many of these conversations. And in many respects, what the Artemis Accord started with was really a reaffirmation of the principles of the Outer Space Treaty for a new generation and for a new time. And I think that that's something that we have to continue to build on. The Artemis Accords aren't a multilateral treaty. They are a shared statement of principles amongst countries. But to really part of global governance, at the end of the day, these have to be issues that get taken up at the only primary body, the only primary forum that we have for adjudicating global governance issues at this time, which is the United Nations. And I think it's important for us to remember that as a community. And it's very easy to shake a head at that, because it's very complex and it's a very long process. But that is currently the forum that is available to humanity.
Yeah.
And we should not sneer at that lightly, because the alternate is not having a forum. And we had some experiences of that in the early first half of the 20th century. And I think space has an incredibly important role to play in all of this. I think governance is something that we should think about, but I would urge us as a community to focus really on global governance through organizations like the UN at this time, to try and advance some of these core issues of space policy, as well as, frankly, issues related to climate resilience and security, which is a place where the UN has been absolutely leading the world in a very, very complex issue, indeed, and one in which space has a lot to contribute.
Yeah, I agree with everything Alex has just said. I'll just add a couple thoughts, perhaps. One is that when people ask me, why are we spending money on space, right? What's the skeptics out there, basically? I tend to give three answers, and we've already covered two of them. One is about its role in our everyday modern economy and its ubiquity in data and so on. One is about inspiration and the human need to have a next frontier, et cetera. And the third is essentially this point, which is that I hope beyond anything that space is where we can transcend geopolitics, where we can work together. And but on the other hand, I think we also have to be ready for the darker turn. And so we need to keep investing in the national security capabilities in space as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I say that, I bring that up because I think it's a real issue. I think it's something that concerns me for a lot of different reasons, even existentially. And of course, most of the time, ultimately treaties are followed because somebody has a bigger gun somehow. And I don't say that with any delight, but I think it's something that we do need to think about and factor in. But I agree. I think it's hopefully space will be one of those things that becomes transcendent, that ultimately people, when they sit down and look at things, will understand that, we've got to come together on this, or everybody's going to lose one way or another. Any last questions, points? We're about out of time. I'm looking at we answered most of the questions here, but any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'll actually just paraphrase Benjamin Franklin when he left, the house there in Philadelphia on this last point, which is that we have a principled global commitment to the perpetual peaceful use of outer space, if we can keep it.
Right.
And I think this community and the broader space community overall has a lot of determining force in whether or not that remains the case. But other than that, yeah, thanks. It's been a good conversation.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Matt?
I'll just say that one thing I've learned getting involved in space over the last decade, or just a bit less, is that one of the greatest things about this new space age is that we are bringing in perspectives from an incredibly diverse range of people who never really thought about space before, but have their own specialty. Because again, as we said, we're reflecting on ourselves as well as we think about the future. So I would just encourage everyone who's watching to keep engaged in this community, bring your ideas forward, even if they seem a bit out there. We need every good idea we can get.
I agree. Pierre, I always remember Pierre Levy, who was, I believe, the French philosopher who coined the phrase collective intelligence, said, nobody knows everything, but everybody knows something. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the messages throughout space. And it always been is we need more people thinking about this. We did a live event to kick off Humanity in Deep Space. And at that event, we had senior people from NASA. We had chefs, we had poets, we had doctors, designers, architects. And it was a really interesting conversation, bringing all those different perspectives. Many of those people who had not, knew a lot, but hadn't been asked to contribute in this particular area. So I would agree, Matt, that we need more and more people into this and encourage people to play that role. Just so you know, we have recorded this, so people who have missed some of it or all of it, you can check it. We'll have it online probably in the next week or so, and we'll let you know that. Also want to thank our sponsors again, Kentucky Science Technology Corporation, National Stem Cell Foundation, Survey from NASA, Space Tango, Sjogren Center, Higher Orbiters Media Collaboratory, and 22 Solutions. It's been a great conversation. I really have enjoyed it. Matt, Alex, I know you guys are busy. Thank you very much. And for everybody else, goodbye.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you for joining us for Humanity in Deep Space. You can find all of our videos, as well as other curated content, at www.humanityindeepspace.com or on YouTube by joining Humanity in Deep Space.